All right, Thanksgiving is over, which means we're officially into Oscar season right now. We've got our first Oscar film that we're covering here on the podcast. Adam Somer is here. Brandon Fallon is here. Myself, the movie nerd, is here. Once again, guys, happy to have you back on. This is quite literally a blast from the past. I've had both of you on individually for episodes now up to this point. Now I've got both of you back on the channel. Oh, man. You guys ready to talk about this movie?
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Honestly, Dom, thank you for having us both back again. That was 2 years ago. A little over 2 years, pretty much 2 years ago that we last did that. So it's great to be back, Brandon. It's great to see you. Let's get right into it.
Yeah, for real.
Yeah.
All of that and more. Stay tuned. All right, yeah, you both are now familiar with the graphics format in general. What's going on, people? So just to clue kind of the audience in before we get started here, we've got only a couple of episodes left in the year. We've got this episode, then we're just to clue you guys in for the schedule. We've got West Side Story after this, then we've got Spider-Man, then we're end of the year with Matrix. We've got 2 episodes left of the Succession recap show. The show is, to say the least, changed just a little bit, but we're going to keep giving you guys the content that it is that you deserve. I know Chris hasn't been on in a while. He'll be back on at least for the last 2 episodes of the year, most definitely. But I got my guys here. Like I said, I've been trying to do a reunion special like this since the beginning of last year with the friggin' best of the decade list, which you guys crushed it so hard on. I had you on for Brandon. I had you on for Last Night in Soho. Adam, I had you on last week for House of Gucci. You really came through in a pinch for me there and really helped me out as far as figuring out what that movie was. But guys, we're here. It's our favorite time of the year again, right? Not for a lot of people, because this is always the end of the year is always that weird time period where like people won't really watch anything unless it's like the big end of the year movie. But like this is our time of the year. This is when the movies that we fucks with come out. These are, again, the slow Oscar bait movies. I know the term has kind of like gotten a little bit of bad word of mouth to it as the time has gone on. But like real quick, before we get into this movie, like talk about like what are your guys' just thoughts on just like Oscar bait movies in general and like kind of the merits that go into them, like the descriptors for them? Because my whole thing is that the problem is that I don't like the term. And there are a lot of movies that kind of file themselves under the term as far as being kind of really uninspired, really boring, and kind of just made to win Oscars, right? But the thing is that like a lot of our favorite movies and a lot of the best movies per year are usually those quote unquote Oscar bait movies. So kick it off. Like what are just your guys' thoughts on that process in general?
I think the term has a negative connotation to it, which you don't really want to throw at somebody's creative work. But sometimes when you see a film, my mind always goes to the Lee Daniels film, The Butler, where I see that and I just say, man, that was really going for the Oscar as opposed to just making an entertaining story in its own right. But yeah, I mean, the term Oscar bait, unfortunately, I think it's still applicable because even in recent years, you still see films.
Yeah, because you still got movies like Green Book winning Best Picture, and now you look at the 2 front runners for this year's Best Picture Oscar race. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on in the discussion after we've broken down this movie. But the 2 front runners right now are Belfast and King Richard, which are 2 movies that could not be more Oscar baity, could not be more emotionally manipulative, could not be more give me my Oscar now if they tried. And it really sucks because in the year that in which we came back from the pandemic, we've got like these really interesting and kind of like inspired movies that are coming out, like The Tragedy of Macbeth, which looks awesome. Like Paul Thomas Anderson's newest movie, which again, unlike Phantom Thread, which is kind of like came out of nowhere, like seems to be like much more so like on like a more of like a public kind of appealing platform. Like it's a lot easier to get across with that movie's message. And even something as technically brilliant as Dune, which is just amazing to see that feels like it's getting all the awards buzz that Blade Runner kind of missed out on as far as 2 years ago. But Adam, talk about it for a second. I can hear you're waiting to go. Like talk about like kind of your relationship with like Oscar bait movies, really what that term means to you.
I mean, when it comes to Oscar bait, it really just comes down to people telling stories and wanting the recognition for it, but telling meaningful stories, telling stories that they can put a lot of information into, that they can put a lot of heart into. Because when you take on a project like that and you want to win an Oscar, you're doing tons of research to make the best movie possible. You know, it's a labor of love and passion and creativity, and you know, with any project you're trying to do, you need to do your research. So Oscar bait, some of it is Oscar baity, but I think it doesn't take away from the other spectacle of just fun movies that you can go and you can turn off, you can tune out and just relax and see a nice fun movie. This is not one of those films, Power of the
Definitely
Dog.
not.
This is a movie that's going to make you think. It's going to raise some very important and meaningful questions. It was fantastic. I mean, I do want to clarify. I think I misspoke last time. I think House of Gucci is higher deserving of a higher score. I gave it a 7.5. I'm gonna bump it up to. I'm gonna say I'm gonna give it a 9.
Really? So it's grown that much for you in hindsight?
Yeah.
Interesting.
I've had time to digest it, and I was able to process this movie a little bit more. I actually took a little bit of notes afterwards.
Certainly easier to understand. I'll say that much rather than House of Gucci.
Yeah. I don't. It just jumps.
I'm still trying to figure out what that fucking movie was going.
Actually,
for.
You know what? I'm gonna roll that back again. 8.5. 8.5 for House of Gucci.
So that's it. We're officially finalized now. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Because here's my whole thing as far as just the term Oscar bait. I think that something happened in the new millennium as far as kind of and I noticed this too as far as kind of the breakdown, because there's this really big divide now more than ever. And this obviously factors into streaming and factors into what people want from their movies just in general. But I've seen this really tremendous divide between the movies that are nominated for Oscars and the movies that people really like watching. Because up until a certain point, and this is the thing that I feel like a lot of more recent moviegoers have forgotten about, is that up until a certain point, a lot of the movies that won Oscars and were nominated for Oscars were like successful movies also in theaters. Again, Titanic won Best Picture after it was already like the most financially successful movie of all time. That's the big thing. Obviously, didn't necessarily deserve it. That's kind of more of a subjective based argument. But as far as I feel like in a lot of more recent years, and I'm trying to remember the year where this really officially started, because I feel like if I'm remembering correctly, the last year that people like really tuned in to watch the Oscars, right? The Oscars have been given that whole big spiel for the last couple of years, like, oh, the ratings go down every year. Guess what? That has to do with the fact that nobody watches TV anymore. Maybe consider that. But the biggest kind of divide for me comes from the fact that around, I'd say 2013, kind of the focus on the films that they nominated were drastically changed, and which is odd because the voting body and the people who vote on these types of movies, I feel like has always been kind of antithetical to almost everyone involved. They can't seem to really grasp the mainstream viewers, right? They'll never reward something like a giant blockbuster spectacle, because that's obviously what is now the money, right? But they won't reward something like that. They won't ever reward a Marvel movie. They won't ever reward a Fast and Furious movie. They will not ever reward a horror movie. They will not ever reward a straight up comedy, right? And so what's it called? So that's the whole thing as far as what's been mired in genre. But the other thing too is that like you'll never also get to see like kind of, for lack of a better word, like a feel good like movie for everyone get nominated. Like The Martian getting nominated for Best Picture 6 years ago is like a rarity. Like you would never see that. Like I feel like kind of almost the big surprise that's going to be coming in for this year is the fact that West Side Story, which is a remake of a movie that already won Best Picture, is currently the front runner, right?
It's Spielberg though.
But again, it's
Spielberg.
Also, but it's got like it's got the musical elements. It's got like the wider appeal. A lot of people can go and watch a musical. They can have fun with it. It's light and fluffy on top of the fact that it's already based off IP that they recognize. And then obviously Paul Thomas Anderson's Licorice Pizza, and then other movies like Belfast, King Richard, movies that are pretty feel good, right? The Oscars, in another attempt to try to actually get the people to watch their show after the absolute disaster that was this year's COVID, with all the COVID restrictions and everything. I feel like the Oscars, you're starting to see a shift back towards movies, kind of like of a wider caliber, right? Especially because mid-budget movies don't go to theaters anymore. They go directly to streaming.
I think some of them do. I think some mid-budget, like only in very specific or like with independent film. I think independent film is making a resurgence. I think A24 as I guess the distributor for a lot of independent films, they are making some of the best original films and movies coming out, because they're taking chances on new, fresh, original ideas, and they're profiting off of it because they're tailoring it to the audience of people like us that want to go and see film, people that want to see a real, a really good story. There's another thing that you mentioned a couple minutes ago about how movies aren't getting recognition or what they deserve. Like, I think there were a lot of movies that speak to many things in different genres, and if they're not a drama, or like or not even if they're not a drama, but if they're, like you said, a horror movie, there are tons of horror movies that can speak to many different things, and they just don't get the recognition they deserve. Like a few years ago, Ari Aster has been snubbed. Jordan Peele has been snubbed, which they were both, Get Out and Us were both deserving.
Well, I don't know. I was about to say, if you're talking for wins or nominations, because Get Out cleared the board as far as nominations go.
Right, but I mean, in terms of what it won.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah, definitely. They'll never reward an actual like risky and daring movie. Brandon, what are some of your thoughts on that?
I think that when you said that in years past, and probably more appropriately decades past, where the best picture contenders or winners were films that everyone saw.
Attempt to make the best picture seemingly the best film that also had the most wide-reaching appeal. And in recent years, they seem to have done away with that because of just kind of the breakdown of the monoculture, right? There really is nothing that's made for everyone anymore.
Right. I don't think any of that is intentional. I don't think the Academy is like this monolithic body that says we are going to use our business strategy to gear and get a wider audience. Because I don't think the Academy...
Well, I'm sure they'd love to think of themselves as that.
The Academy is built up of everybody in the film industry, from critics to people who just joined to actors. I don't think they're worried about the ratings and we got to get all these people to watch the Oscars.
Because they make a pretty big stink about it every year.
Well, news outlets might, but I think back in the day, you had a lot of studios giving a lot of money to big adult dramas, and you don't get that nowadays. You either get tentpole movies that are known, that they're proven that they're going to make a buck, and then if you want to make like an actual, I don't want to say an actual artistic, but if you want to make an artistic film that is rare, that a studio wouldn't necessarily make, you need to do like $3 million or less, and it has to be a really kind of small indie. There isn't that middle ground of like a lot of budget going to high adult dramas. You get that with big names like Ridley Scott doing The Martian, or Spielberg doing West Side Story, or Scorsese doing The Irishman. You get that because they're established names. My prediction is that the names that are being built now will get to that point where Ari Aster and Greta Gerwig and who else? Jordan Peele,
Barry Jenkins, Robert Eggers. The list goes on. The Safdies. I'm still waiting for their next movie.
They're all in that position that the filmmakers of the 70s were, but when they were just starting, like Spielberg and Brian De Palma and Coppola and Scorsese, they weren't, and even George Lucas, they were all making kind of smaller American Graffiti, Taxi Driver, Mean Streets before they were making Star Wars and Goodfellas. All the directors now will get to that point when they're those proven household
they're still relatively new and they're still being established. People forget that Black Panther: Wakanda Forever is only going to be Ryan Coogler's 4th film that he's directed.
So my basic point is I just don't think it's some wide thing that's very intentional. I just think it's a lot of it has to do with streaming. A lot of it has to do with...
I'm actually glad that you brought that up, because that's really kind of the last point that I wanted to bring up, is that the other thing that I feel like that kind of is the difference, right? Because there's always something new in each of these decades whenever these filmmakers are popping up. And the biggest thing for me is trying to figure out what the streaming factor of it is all now, because it's interesting, because I've been listening to a lot of interviews recently with smaller filmmakers that opened up movies that may not necessarily get the Oscar recognition, like interviews with like Sean Baker and Mike Mills and Ronaldo Marcus Green, who just did King Richard. And the biggest thing that they're saying is right now, the options for these filmmakers seem to be only one of two things: streaming or big budget tentpoles. And that seems to be really the only recognition. In streaming, sure, you'll get the money that you'll get all the money in the world, right? The streamers are what's funding like the filmmakers, right? But will your film get the widespread recognition based on name alone that you would have wanted to, because Scorsese and Spike Lee and them seem to be the only exceptions, but the smaller guys you don't necessarily know yet, versus getting stuck immediately into tentpole movies, where it's like, as much as I love what Ryan Coogler did with Black Panther, I want to see him do something else interesting. And knowing that he was going into Black Panther Wakanda Forever immediately afterwards, I'm like, really? And like, it makes me worried as far as like, kind of what these filmmakers, what they're going to be able to do with them. And so I think that kind of in order to segue it into the movie that we're talking about now, I think that that's a really interesting discussion to be had about this director that we have that does this movie, Jane Campion, because in a very, very ironic twist of fate, this year seems to be shaping up to be another Jane Campion versus Steven Spielberg for Best Director and Best Picture. 30 years later, after they were competing head-to-head back in '93 for Schindler's List versus The Piano. So I find that really fascinating how these things continue to turn around. And you want to talk about somebody that has had a really, really fascinating history with Hollywood. Her films that she's directed included Peel and Exercise and Discipline, Passionless Moments, A Girl's I'm not looking at the right one. Those are short films. Oh my God. Includes Sweetie and Angel at My Table, The Piano, The Portrait of a Lady, Holy Smoke, In the Cut, and then her last film that she actually directed before this was 2009's Bright Star. And then the last couple of years, she's actually been in TV. She directed the 2 Top of the Lake miniseries. And I think that what's really fascinating here is she is a director that seems to have been navigating the current film economy really, really interestingly. Because what's the other thing that you hear a lot of people say? Oh, all these directors and really good, interesting stories that we want to see done as films are being done as TV shows, right? And that could be good or bad. And I think you're seeing the gamut start to shift, because the problem is, at the end of the day, with all this content that is now available, people just don't have time. They don't have time to watch all these TV shows, and it's a lot easier to watch a film. So I find it really interesting how for her next film, she goes for a Western that's an adaptation that obviously of a very famous book that is being posited for Oscars, but is being posted on Netflix of all places. So I find that really interesting, because Netflix also has been having this really interesting conundrum the last couple of years where, again, they get like all the nominations in the world and they maybe win like 1 Oscar. Like they had 2 movies, Marriage Story and The Irishman, that were both nominated for like 10 Oscars each. And the only win that they got collectively between them was Laura Dern winning supporting actress for Marriage Story. Like, it was because we know that the Oscars hate Netflix. But so this is a film that, if we're going to break it down to its brass tacks, right? This is a film that centers around Montana at the turn of the century ranchers, right? You have 2 rancher brothers portrayed respectively by Benedict Cumberbatch and Jesse Plemons. And basically the idea is that they're settling on a ranch. The one ends up marrying kind of I don't even know what Kirsten Dunst's position is, kind of the washerwoman there.
Yeah.
And kind of like
she's of a lower class.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So he marries her, and then kind of like, how things start to shift as Benedict Cumberbatch takes an interest in her son, portrayed by Cody Smith-McPhee, and certain like kind of interesting and certain motivations are revealed. That's about like kind of as much as I can really give as far as the plot goes, because it's one of those things where you really do have to pick this movie apart with a fine-tooth comb. Because if I can just dive into like kind of what this movie is, it's another one of those movies that is very slow, very deliberate in pace, and very kind of, it's one of those very introspective. There's a lot of like, shots of beautiful scenery that you see in a lot of these types of movies.
Gorgeous.
And I can say right now that if you're a film aficionado, you are going to fucking love this movie, because like I said, this is a movie that is made for people like us, not for Marvel fans. This is a movie that is well-intentioned with its craft. Every shot is completely intentional. You can tell that like there's an interest kind of in pursuing subject matter that like is much more so relevant, but it still pursues the escapist angle as far as like wanting to like not make it like blatantly relevant in your face, like an obvious message movie like Joker. But I don't know. Break it down for me, guys, because I kind of push you guys to watch this movie. What are your guys' thoughts on The Power of the Dog? Brandon, you go first.
I really enjoyed it. I just thought it was when it ends, I just go, that was a solid movie. Like everything worked. Like there was nothing about it that I was like, oh, that could have been better. Performances are great. It looks beautiful. I think the main thing about the movie that makes it really good is the themes of it and how you can pick apart things and analyze, because the plot is fairly straightforward if you're just looking at it from beginning to end, A to Z. You could watch it, and maybe somebody who isn't paying attention or doesn't want to pay attention or isn't seeing it, like Benedict Cumberbatch's character is saying, they would just say like, oh yeah, it's this movie, and then by the end this one thing happens. And when this one thing happens at the end, it could kind of either dismiss the whole movie for some people, or it could maybe enhance it. For me, it enhanced it just because while I understood the why, I wanted to understand the themes behind it and how it is, why they chose to shoot it in a certain way and why the characters might have been motivated to do that, what it means in terms of the themes, because it's a really great film about loneliness. I mean, there's a lot of other subtexts of, gaslighting and toxic masculinity and homosexuality and kind of burying one's true self and suppressing it with a facade of anger and machismo. But I think the theme of loneliness is what stuck with me the most, because it's this really grand, look to it with all these prairies and things like that. But it's more so like a play with 4 key characters, and all of them, even though they're in the presence of one another, are so lonely and alone. And that's what I really liked about it, is that it's just these people that just aren't communicating right at all.
I love that. That's actually that. Oh man, that's great. Yeah, because you get like kind of like almost like the 4 different quadrants of loneliness. The one who's trying to like just cover it up and make it seem like, oh, I don't need anyone, when really he's probably the most needing companionship. You got the one who is like kind of just reluctantly accepted it, and it may maybe be having like adverse effects on his psyche. You have the one who is just totally not handling it at all and just slowly crumbling from within. And then you have the one where it's like, yeah, I'm just kind of there, because let's be honest, like I think that like if I could throw a couple nitpicks at the board, it's that Jesse Plemons kind of just like disappears into the ether after a while, and after a while he's kind of just there as like a comforting force for Kirsten Dunst as like the thing between her and Cumberbatch starts to come to light. I think I had written down in my review here, it's what's it called? It's Jane Campion presents a tale of grooming, potential incest, rejection of society, and training your successor in the story of ranch hands in Montana at the turn of the century, right? You always see this really interesting, it always really fascinates me whenever you have this examination of like kind of people in these isolated instances, kind of like away from society, especially in different time periods, right? Where like kind of the before times of technology. And, obviously you see some sense of like modern technology and but like, again, like early 1900s, but kind of in like the psychology of people and how they deal with like kind of like all the crippling doubt and insecurity and all that stuff that we constantly have to deal with on a daily basis, just functioning as adults. And we have social media that just like constantly keeps us occupied every instance. But it always fascinates me how like people back in the day did it. And all of a sudden you start to wonder, it's like, wow, no wonder kind of like these sadistic people who we constantly question. It's like, oh man, what was their motivation? It starts to become a lot more clear. And I think that this film to me was the best example of like, I'm trying to think of like the least expletive metaphor that I could come up with. It's probably like the most drawn out example of like of like kind of like a sexual conquest that I've ever seen. If that like kind of like the cleanest possible way that I can put, because it's like Cumberbatch, you could tell, is somewhere between the and he performs it beautifully, right? I really want to talk about Cumberbatch for a little bit, just kind of what he brings to this performance and kind of like how that is kind of like a takedown of his previous characters, because Cumberbatch is a guy who's known for being like so squeaky clean, so very, very pristine, very formal, even though he's a Marvel superhero, and still his whole thing is like how, okay, he's like one of like 3 Marvel characters that doesn't make a crack every 3 seconds or a sarcastic comment. And so this, you see him a lot more like dirty, you see him a lot more like grungy, you see him a lot more. The thing that I loved about his character is how he is somebody who is kind of like so accepted this position that he's in and is just become unapologetic about it, right? I really love when like they can portray characters like that, because those are the characters that, like, if not to clue anyone really too much into my psyche, but like kind of I relate to the most, just as far as like, oh, I don't know how well I can relate to anyone. I wish I could just kind of like be myself. And that kind of like I think is I love when those characters can just be portrayed like so unabashedly on screen, and how he kind of like meets his match in some instance with the Cody Smith McPhee character. But Adam, I can tell you've been waiting. You've been waiting for like 20 minutes to like, so patiently waiting. What were your thoughts on this movie?
Okay, first off, this is probably now like film of the year for me. It's on the top 3 at least.
So wait, House of Gucci is now not your film of the year?
No. Well, no, actually, Green Knight was my film of the year.
I haven't seen that.
It's amazing. So I'm gonna put it in the top 3 slot, for the simple reason I love westerns. We don't see films like this often anymore. The last Western that I saw in theaters was the Magnificent Seven remake, which is just a recreation of Seven Samurai.
That may as well be a Marvel superhero movie. It's even got a Marvel star in it.
It was fun. But I enjoyed it for what it was. Either way, this movie is its own thing in its entirety. If it doesn't get Best Adapted Screenplay for the Oscars, I'll be a little upset. But seriously, I think this movie deserves every nomination that comes its way. Like, I wrote down, I'm like, wow, like from the costume to the performances, directing, the cinematography, the sound was really good. And sound mixing is so important for film. If the movie doesn't sound good, no one's going to enjoy it. Sound is so important. But
you're not the majority of people who are starting to cut you off, but a majority of people who are going to be watching this are not going to be watching this in a theater. It makes it even more important.
Yeah. And so a big thing for me, I liked how many themes this movie was able to touch on. I mean, this is a perfect example of, I'm not very familiar with Jane Campion's work, but now I need to be. Yeah. I need to research.
I definitely recommend The Piano, more. And I'd recommend The Top of the Lake show that she did.
This movie is a really great example of like feminist film theory, because it touches on things like the male and female gaze, which she uses both of. She touches upon Freudian theory, which is a huge thing for Peter. Not only Peter, I mean, every character has some kind of Freudian something going on.
Yeah, just look at the scene where George brings in his parents, and then Cumberbatch shows up after the fact, and he's like, "Oh, I wasn't allowed in because I hadn't watched."
Yeah. And I took down notes because this movie is so incredibly layered. I was like, this is too much to just go off the cuff. So I wrote down something to refer to on the side here. But no, I really do think that this movie touched upon every single facet of what film is and can be about. This movie talked about, class and wealth disparity and equality. They don't take Kirsten Dunst's character, Rose, they don't take her seriously at all, simply because of who she is until she starts dating George.
Right.
So George kind of brings her in, and they don't respect her. They don't like her. They mock her. They mimic her. Same thing. It's like Benedict's character. What was his name?
Phil, right? Is that his
Phil?
name?
Yes, yeah. Phil. He's mocking and mimicking out of a place of insecurity. All these characters are so three-dimensional. They felt really organic working together. I really liked seeing Jesse Plemons and Kirsten Dunst working together. I love seeing real life couples acting together. Yeah. So that was really cool.
And plus, I'm pretty sure they're like contractually obligated to be together now and everything since Fargo season 2.
I haven't watched that. But this movie really did touch on so many things in such a short amount of time, which is why it's so high up on my list now for the year. That it talked about religion. I mean, it was pretty much a biblical retelling. It kind of was inspired by biblical stories and some mythology, and it was very well rounded, very well done. So that's my main breakdown.
Well, you talk about just like kind of like coming from like the place of insecurity, right? I already know that like a lot of people are going to come out like once this really starts to catch on, if it catches on. I don't know if it will, Western in the social media age. That's already a tough sell to begin with. But I can already hear people saying, "Oh, this is the new Brokeback Mountain," and I'm like, look, already Brokeback Mountain got like an unnecessary like kind of thing thrown at it as being like, oh, it's the gay Cowboys movie, when obviously it was so much more than that. And I really don't want that to happen to this movie, even though like that kind of happens to every one of these movies that come out in time for Oscars, because this is so much more than that. This is a movie that like literally where its characters are quite literally frothing at the mouth because they're like, we have so much that we need to get out of our system, but we don't know how to exude it properly. And so obviously, you have like the playful teasing and the mockery at first, which of course is the presentation of like kind of their toxic inner masculinity. And I love how Jane Campion presents this so well. Jane Campion also, I'll point out, one of only 7 women that have been nominated for Best Director, just in general, 2 of whom I would like to admit only happened last year with Emerald Fennell and Chloe Zhao. But Jane Campion has this really interesting kind of examination where what's it called? Obviously, she's one of the few directors that like actually, has a legitimate eye into the female gaze that most directors just don't, just because the majority of directors are predominantly male. But I love how too she's able, because again, like this is the thing that you notice with like a decent amount of female directors that were kind of coming up throughout the last couple of years. Like just look at like what everything that Lynn Ramsey was able to do with You Were Never Really Here, where she essentially made the most accurate Batman movie like ever made, like the most accurate vigilante movie ever made, which is like, yeah, these guys are fucking miserable and like are dejected from society. This is not fun or something that you should be trying to root for. And she does the same thing here, where she literally plays around with like kind of the ideas and kind of the stigmas that we have in our head of like cowboys, where again, like it's ironic that we talk so much about goddamn superhero movies when the westerns were essentially superhero movies before superhero movies were a thing, where they were the most popularist form of entertainment, so much so that they kind of like bought and sold themselves into extinction in a way. And now she's bringing it up and doing this once again thing where it's like, oh, those cowboys, those ranch hands that seem like, oh, like the heroes back in the day. And she's breaking them down and kind of showing like what it is that these people actually deal with on a daily basis. But I like how she doesn't make them sadistic for the sake of being sadistic, right? She's playing around with a lot of interesting themes about like kind of inner homosexuality and what these people are dealing with. But rather than just have it be like kind of like, the forbidden fruit kind of a thing, she uses almost like kind of the different quadrants of loneliness in order to like kind of do this really interesting examination into like, okay, like how like kind of social classes perceive each other, which I think is something that I'm really, really glad that like a lot of good movies now are starting to look into, as far as like disparities between economic classes resulting in almost every single like kind of struggle that we see when it comes to like racial struggles, religious struggles, obviously struggles over identity and sexual orientation and all that stuff. That stuff is really fascinating, but I almost love how too like the answer is quite literally, it's like, no, it's like it's just the way that nature goes. This is ultimately to me a movie about nature and what happens within the natural order of things. Brandon, did you pick up on any of that while you were watching the movie?
Yeah, I did, because you're only dealing with a handful of characters alone in this isolated area, and I don't know if this was intentional, but yes, they had a grand look to it with the backdrops, but it felt oddly small. Like whenever they're in the backyard of their ranch, it's not like it just goes on and on and on. It goes up into a mountain, and then the mountain kind of just bookends it, and they're kind of trapped in a certain way. So even though they have like a playground to play in, it's not like you're watching like this, like some of the old westerns where it's like, wow, like they could just keep riding forever and ever. Like there's a finite amount of real estate that they're operating within. As far as, what was the question you brought up in terms of nature?
It's a movie about nature.
Because I got more of a Shakespearean tragedy out of it in a sense, because the main character is Benedict Cumberbatch's Phil Burbank, and you're watching him slowly realize, but not even like fully knowing himself, the things that he needs to change within himself. But when he finally gets to the point where he thinks he may or may not start to act on certain urges, or maybe try to like shift certain personalities, his demise is already in motion because of things that happened in the past. So it's really, I looked at it as more as like a sad story, because when you first are introduced to him, you can kind of dismiss it, and you could throw a blanket on his character and just say toxic masculinity. That's it.
It's a generalization.
And what the director did so great, Jan Campion, is that Jan Campion?
Jan Campion, yeah.
Okay, is that she didn't just, because I've seen movies like that where that issue is presented as that, and that's just the problem, and the things that are analyzed are the solutions, but the actual problem is never analyzed. It's just presented in a box like, yeah, it's this. So the fact that was so layered with the stories about his past, and then the Bronco Henry character, or Harry, and
who he's like obsessed with.
Right.
Yeah, and you don't even know if it was sexual abuse. You don't know if it was like it's so left wide open as to well, was it just a genuine friendship and mentorship? You just know that there's something.
There was definitely a sexual aspect.
Right. Oh, yeah. Like that much is pretty obvious. Yeah. But like I love too how the movie like leaves it ambiguous, and like almost like the ambiguity of it like kind of like makes Benedict Cumberbatch's character, like everything that he's doing with the Cody Smith McPhee character, like that much more interesting, because the fact that you don't know where it comes from. You're like, okay, was this mutually consensual? Was this grooming? Was this kind of just a matter of circumstance? You know, kind of like that unknown nature, that ambiguity kind of adds so much more kind of looming over the existential dread to it. Yeah, go ahead.
And one point I have is the actual, like, if you read the bio on like a Letterboxd or Netflix or something, it says that this guy starts tormenting the wife and the son.
Right.
I like how it was never so obvious that he was like torturing these people and he was like conniving to try to like F with them. It was so subtle where if you're watching it in the moment, you think that they just don't like each other. And then it's not until you see the effects that it has on the Kirsten Dunst character that you really take a step back and say, oh, wow, he was actually doing some real harm. And even at the end of the movie, when he loses the hides, you kind of sympathize with him at first. You're like, God damn it. Like she sold the hides. Like he needed that for the rope and X, Y, and Z. And you're with him for a second, but then you're not, but then you think you're like, yeah, but that this is all your own doing. And, you know, but one point off topic, you bring up the Western and how maybe the Western is kind of like, you know, gone away. I would disagree because you still see quite a few Westerns nowadays. No, they're not these major budget things, but like, you know, just this year earlier, you had The Harder They Fall with Idris Elba and Jonathan Majors. And one of the biggest shows on network TV is Yellowstone.
That's true.
It's so big
on Paramount Plus.
They got that prequel 1883, which is like I only saw the trailer. It's like a true Western, like back in the day. Like it. So I think the Western, because it's always been there within the mainstream moviegoers' interest. This is a different type of Western because there's always been, in my opinion, two types of Westerns with various tangents. You either get like a tried and true Western, like that's kind of enjoying like what it is and like that time and kind of romanticizing it, whether it's Magnificent Seven or, you know, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly or something like that. But then you get those introspective Westerns like Chloe Zhao's The Rider or this. Those two are a lot more similar. And those are the ones that are more interesting. I don't think they're going to catch on as much as one would like, but I also don't think it's going to get dismissed as the gay cowboy movie like Brokeback Mountain.
Please, God, no. Well, please, God, we don't need another one of those.
Well, but here's the thing with, you know, with The Power of the Dog, there is so much to it where I think the homosexuality undertones were something that I definitely thought of as I was leaving, but it was far from the only thing or the main thing that I was talking about. So I think in that respect, it's kind of impossible for it to be dismissed as just another type of a Brokeback Mountain situation.
Well, that's so interesting that you bring that up because the whole thing is that almost one could make an argument. I feel like it describes a lot of earlier episodes of Game of Thrones where it's like, wow, I just feel like I watched something where so much happened, but at the same time, nothing happened at all. Because you can literally make that argument. Because
I don't know.
Well, because when I'll give the perfect example. When I started watching the movie for like the first hour, I'm constantly wondering, I'm like, what is happening? Where is this going? Like, I'll admit, I was very confused when I watched it the first time. And it wasn't until I had to turn it back on and watch it a second time. Thank you, Netflix, for giving me that option. Where I'm literally like, oh, I get it. Because it's like, you really have to like study it and understand like kind of the underlying layers because it's not a surface level movie at all. Like somebody who's just watching this from like a surface level standpoint is going to be lost. Right?
They're going to be confused.
Exactly. Which automatically makes that a hard sell because again,
I don't know if they would be lost or confused. I think they would understand the basic plot of it. I just think they'd be bored.
But the point being, it's a movie that you actually have to sit down and pay attention with and not just have on in the background while you're doing laundry or something, you know, which again, like Netflix makes content for like pretty much every person, every purpose for during the day. But this is one of those things where it's like, this is not one of those like casual Netflix and chill, hanging out, having a fun Friday night type of movies. This is a movie where it's like, no, you got to sit there and you got to watch and you got to pay attention because there is so much happening under the surface that you would be lost if you looked away for even 1 second. Because for me, I feel like it's all perfectly captured in the moment when obviously Cumberbatch starts to get sick at the end, which again, like, so we're in spoiler territory. So basically the way that this movie ends, it ends on a really fascinating note. We're halfway through the movie, right? Cumberbatch almost like kind of takes Cody Smith-McPhee under his wing and starts to like learn to teach him how to become a man, quote unquote, at least from like the outset. But Cody Smith-McPhee also discovers like several like early on like pornographic magazines that Cumberbatch has in a secret stash and also catches him like caressing this handkerchief that belonged to this person named Bronco Henry, who he so idolized and so who he trained with. Obviously, the attention, the illusion there is that, or the impetus there being that, he may have had previous sexual relations with this person. And so you start to see this really interesting thing happening where I'm not quite sure if what we're supposed to be watching is grooming, but at the end, it's revealed that after a certain incident involving certain cowhides happens, because Cumberbatch is making this rope using cowhides for Cody Smith McPhee. Cody Smith McPhee brings him this other cowhide that he got from this dead cow that he found just randomly on the side of the road and infects him. And then it ends with Cumberbatch slowly dying of an infection. And it's revealed, with Cody Smith McPhee having done that to him, in order to potentially save his mom. Although from what I don't know, that's really the only moment of plot confusion for me.
I thought it made sense.
Yeah, no, you could see the envy he had for George early on. Like, he was definitely, because every time George brought up Rose, there was always some kind of resentment or disdain from Phil. Phil's character, you said you thought he was like the main character.
I would say he's the main character. Yeah, he's marketed as the film revolves around. Well, that's what's interesting too. This is an antagonist story ultimately.
Right.
We kind of live now in an age where the antagonists have officially become more
of a protagonist,
more interesting than the protagonist in the traditional sense. Yeah. So now I feel like if you don't have an antagonist as your story, like why do you think Avengers: Infinity War is my favorite Marvel movie? Because the antagonist is the main character.
Yeah. And I think there's something to be said there about. Someone said it earlier. We talked about this movie at its core is about nature versus nurture, or nature and nurture,
both working in conjunction with each other.
Yeah, and that goes all the way back to, the first, at least what I think. Not that there weren't stories way before that, but like with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or Frankenstein's monster. He's not Frankenstein. He's Frankenstein's monster. And that's such a English literature,
wow. Wait, I was about to say, way to flex your English language knowledge there, Adam.
Yeah. Yeah. But there is something to be said there about the idea of the antagonist versus protagonist, and who is prioritized in the story. Because it does a good job of touching upon every character's struggle and what they might be going through. I think Rose's character was incredibly interesting, and she gave that character a lot of depth. And she doesn't even really get that much screen time. I think she gets a good amount, but I would have liked to see more.
Well, here's the interesting thing about that. Like, I love that you brought that up, because Kirsten Dunst, like, first off, just the fact that she's finally going to be getting her first Oscar nomination, is insane to me, because I've always thought that, for me, I personally think those Spider-Man movies were both the best and the worst possible thing that could have ever happened for her, because she kind of stuck in that typecast range for a while, and it took her like a long time to get out of it. Ironically enough, for me, like Fargo season 2 was like the big thing that showed me it's like, okay, she can actually act. And I love the things that she's doing in this movie, where she is presented as kind of like almost like this traditionalist damsel in distress, but then as time goes on, like you really start to see like kind of and at first I thought it was going to be like, this is going to be another situation of showing, this time period sucked for women, because literally every single decade prior to say 1999, I would say sucked for women. But the biggest thing for me is kind of like showing like kind of the evolving psychological breakdown of like kind of her breaking psychosis, just for lack of like kind of like the effects of kind of being in her social class has on her, which is not really something that I've seen presented in that kind of a way before in really any movie, because this is ultimately the trick about most movies, right? Most movies present people within their social classes, and the ironic thing is that you never see people in lower social classes wanting to really strive and wanting to really climb and wanting to really. No, I don't think so. Every single time I've seen a person in that level of a societal climb, it's either they're perfectly content, and then the one person that wants something bigger, they just marry rich, and that's kind of their only way to get out of it. And you do see that happen here, but you see it happen in like almost like, again, like where it's like, okay, kind of like in a way the only like pure like thing that happens in this movie is the fact that like, Jesse Plemons is kind of like the only person that actually like understands what he needs to do for himself. And he's not really looking at it in a way to like benefit her per se. Like, he's not looking at it as saving her per se. Like, he does seem to be doing it because he genuinely cares, which is different than what you've seen, right? But you always see that happen in movies. And I love how in this film, you take this breakdown of these characters in these kind of like traditionalist like sets, right? Where the ironic thing is that there's not really too much of a class divide between Cumberbatch and Kirsten Dunst, right? One's a ranch hand, one's a maid, for lack of a better word. But
yeah,
just I thought she was more of like the dine, like wherever they went to eat in the beginning.
Whatever her position is, right? There's not really that much of a social divide between them, right? But because Cumberbatch prides himself in his skilled area, and obviously also because of the gender divides at the time, he still sees himself as superior to her.
Yeah.
And you see kind of like that breakdown within her quadrant, but not in a way that like feels quote unquote forced, while at the same like I whoever's point it was that brought it up about like kind of each person like kind of representing their own quadrant, like the male versus the female gaze. I think it's portrayed brilliantly here, because you never once get the sense of like these characters are like competing for screen time, for lack of a better word, if that makes sense.
It's very well
like
balanced. It's very well balanced when it comes to balancing the characters, because sometimes it jumps to one person, like the third sequence or the third act, because I like that it split it up into the different segments, which is just the standard narrative storytelling writing plot devices. So it that was a really long sequence, but it did tend to split to different characters and prioritize their portion of the story, which just helped build even further with what the script was doing, which is why I think the script is so well done here. I mean, Jane Campion, I wasn't familiar. I am now familiar with her work, and I need to check out the rest, but it did a incredible job of making lots of three-dimensional characters with real struggles and purposes and different motivations and intents. And the kid was I mean, he gives a great performance. You're going to talk about Cody. What was his name?
Yeah, Cody Smith McPhee. Yeah, he's been popping up in a couple of, unfortunately, again, like another poor leftover from those god-awful last couple of X-Men movies, where he was unfortunately cast as the younger version of Nightcrawler in the X-Men Apocalypse.
He did a good job.
No, he was fine. But like I said, it was cast for a thankless part. Ironically enough, I thought that his bit at the end of X-Men Dark Phoenix was probably the best part. But like he's been popping up, having these one-off parts in these movies that have been popping up recently. He was just in what's it called? The oh my God, what was it? He was the kid in the second Apes of the Apes movies, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. He was in that.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, he wasn't just in that.
Well, no, he wasn't. Well, because you know what the problem is? It's that him and Asa Butterfield, I feel like, have been competing for like the exact same roles for like the last like 5 or 6 years. And the problem is that you literally can't tell those two apart. Literally, if you put those two next to each other, I feel like the only difference is the fact that one's slightly skinnier. Like, I'm gonna play a game with you guys real quick. So just real quick, which of those two is in Hugo?
Yeah. I don't know.
Hey, got it. Ding, ding, ding. Brandon, Asa Butterfield. Now, which one of those two was in? See, I already forgot because they're so interchangeable at this point. Well, I think the other one's Australian, one is American. But yeah, the Cody Smith McPhee character, I think, is interesting because I don't know. Could you make the incel argument for his character? I feel like you could. Yeah. I feel like you really could there. And I think that's what's so fascinating about watching the two, him and Cumberbatch, bounce off of each other, is the fact that it's like, okay, so you have the one closeted guy and the one incel up and coming. Oh, that's just that alone right there, like, makes for like a really fascinating. And the thing is, like, Campion understands that, but she knows how to present it classily and not in like a really schlocky, like, obvious way, like Todd Phillips did with Joker. So I think that that's what makes it like really, really rich and even more rich and fascinating, is you're almost like seeing like this homage, like something like a Double Indemnity. Almost like the old school black and white films, where obviously they were restricted by the Hays Code, so they couldn't like show anything like exclusively like expletive or anything like that. But I love how, like, again, the tension comes from the fact that you don't know what's going to happen, because you're watching these kind of drawn out conversations, and like, because the characters are so well established, it's everything that we like about like good filmmaking. This is what I talk about when I say that like we love why we love these types of movies, because just the richness of the characters. Character creates drama.
He's a chilling character. Story.
Yeah,
he gives a very chilling and dark and stoic performance, which is something to be said. I mean, I'm not sure how old he is, but
I think he's like 25, 26, I think.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly.
Mean, him, there's another guy who he reminded me of, Barry Connigan.
Barry Keoghan. Yeah.
Keoghan. He was like similar situation in
Killing of a Sacred Deer.
Killing of a Sacred Deer. Exactly. That's what it reminded me of a little bit. I do think the incel argument is an accurate description for his character. I mean, the one girl walks into the room and he's dissecting the rabbit.
Yeah, which was crazy. After we saw him caught it, like cuddle it, I was like, whoa, what are we doing here?
Visceral. I mean, there were so many moments in this that were visceral, and I do want to touch upon. I know this movie is sparking a lot of controversy regarding.
It's been 3 days.
Right, and I'm already getting sent articles about like PETA talking about the ethical treatment of. Apparently, was the bull actually castrated on set? I don't know.
Wait, really? Oh wow, I missed all those.
I mean, I don't know what the New Zealand laws are with animals and ethics and how that works with animal like handling on set, but you can see some of. I mean, it's a hard thing to talk about. Obviously, it's distressing to see any animals in pain. Like you could see the horse was in distress when he's taking his anger out on it.
Yeah.
But I mean, that might also be the camera angle. Obviously, when they cut to the close up of his face, he's not hitting anything.
Right. Well, we know obviously that there are a ton of like animal training and a lot of like attention to safety, especially with these types of budgets behind
normally
the scenes.
There are. It's just if that's just sparking controversy to get people to talk about the movie, that's a different thing. It's a touchy subject. And I did want to bring it up because my friends in our group chat the other day, they brought it up. And I was like, whoa, like I need to read more into it. Normally with any animals on set, it's much more strict now than it used to be.
Yeah.
Because back in the day,
they used to just straight up like murder animals on set.
Exactly. And they didn't do it with any kind of, it was very, very different.
Yeah, things have drastically improved since then.
And I don't think Jane Campion would let that happen on her set. If it did, I would be very surprised. But I did want to address it because it's something that's sparking controversy.
Yeah,
I just want to clarify. Allegedly, I'm not stating that as fact. I think allegedly that's what the people are talking about. It's one of those things that is such a touchy subject in film when working with animals to make sure that they're handled properly,
Yeah, it's a tricky subject just in general, but to me that reeks of just generating controversy because that's literally I don't know why, but like that is now like a part of the Oscar selling process, for lack of a better word, as far as selling it to awards. But like if they're already getting a smear campaign started against this movie, I'm like, wow, they're getting started early. But so in order to kind of like wrap this conversation up, just in general, so. Where do we think this is going to go as far as the Oscars appeal? Because my whole thing is, I already know this is getting all the awards. This is getting picture, director, adapted screenplay.
You think it's going to get the big five?
Oh, it's absolutely getting the big five for nominations wise. Actor for Cumberbatch, supporting actor for Kirsten Dunst, more than likely supporting actor for Cody Smith-McPhee, because there's all four of the actor races are really weird this year. There aren't really any clear-cut outlines yet. It's going to be really interesting once kind of the preliminary ceremonies happen, but. I guess my interest is like, does this movie go anywhere as far as Oscars awards? Because this happens literally every single year with all the Best Picture nominees, where I'm like, okay, half these movies actually deserve to be here, and half these movies are like bullshit Oscar bait feel good movies. So I guess my question is like, is this the one where like we actually see some wins? Because the big thing around this is that Cumberbatch right now is the favorite to win Best Actor. It seemed for a minute that it was going to be Will Smith, but the scales seem to have hedged back towards Cumberbatch. So if Cumberbatch wins Best Actor for this, that could be something really big and huge for Netflix, because Netflix has never had a win of that caliber. Or does this end up being yet another instance of, okay, the Oscars just completely ignoring a movie from Netflix because it's Netflix and they hate Netflix just for the simple fact that they're like, the Netflix has for the longest time been like, the first real instance of like danger to like kind of the old school, like, historic, what's it called? The old school, like kind of, brick and mortar Hollywood establishments.
I'll start. I don't think that the Academy has like that much of a disdain for Netflix, because
could have told me otherwise.
Maybe they did at a certain point, but times are changing, people change too. Marriage Story and The Irishman, and Roma, were huge Oscar movies. No, they didn't win a bunch of awards, but that's just because of competition. You know, like in The Irishman, you had Joe Pesci and Pacino nominated for the same thing. Their votes canceled each other out. So obviously Pitt was going to win. You know, like I just think it comes down to that. And I think that is the reason. I don't know. I haven't seen all of the competition yet. I've seen a few. I've seen Belfast. I've seen
they're still being released. That's the thing. They're still having limited release. West Side Story is next week. Nightmare Alley's in 2 weeks.
I'm gonna see all them as they come out. I've watched this movie. I really liked it. I don't think I quite liked it as much as you guys. I think I really liked like the themes about it. I think there were some nitpicks here and there, maybe with like the third act and like especially that ending, maybe feeling a little rushed. Like it just felt like we should have kind of sat in that moment a little bit longer, maybe an extra 10-15 minutes. But you know, and by the way, just side note, my favorite scene in the movie is the piano scene and the dinner. I just want to say that.
It's awesome.
That scene,
well, when he's playing and he takes his hands away?
No, not that. The scene where they ask Kirsten Dunst's
character. When they tell her to play.
That scene it just nails awkward, cringe tension where you're just going, oh, God, no.
But also
this is terrible.
Doesn't it remind you of those family gatherings where your family would like, oh, he knows how to do that thing. Go and play. You sing for us. Go and do that. Oh,
yeah, it's like, well, it's kind of like that way. It's kind of that way people look at like entertainers as like
again more of like the classifieds, because where do you see upper class families? That's where that happens.
Well, I mean, you know, you see it too. Like, I mean, you'll see like a middle class person watch TV and solely look at, you know, they won't look at movie and filmmakers as entertainers and artists. They'll look at them as monkeys and jesters that need to entertain them after a day's work. It all happens both ways. I don't think it's as black and white as that. But back to the film. There were some nitpicks. I really enjoyed it. I loved how much I could kind of analyze the themes. I think it's like for me, I know we're not doing ratings yet. I think it's a solid 4 out of 5. I don't know if it ranks super high in my top of the year. As far as Oscars go, I think it's one of those movies that's going to get nominated for a lot. I don't think it's going to win a lot. It might. Again, I have to see all the rest. Right now, if I had to say which ones it's best suited to win, I'd say maybe adapted screenplay and maybe like, I can't even say cinematography because Belfast had amazing cinematography.
No, and
and
Dune,
West Side Story.
Pretty much for me, it's like Dune is the thing to overcome as far as the technical awards go.
Oh, Dune winning cinematography. Yeah,
Dune,
maybe.
I right now have Dune winning every technical that it's nominated for: visual, cinematography, score, sound, editing.
Is that
sound editing? No, he traded up this time. It's Greig Fraser who did Rogue One and Vice.
Yeah. Oh, so I think cinematography, it's Dune. I think maybe like West Side Story or Belfast might be in the conversation slightly. But as far as this movie and like Oscar races, I personally don't see it winning anything just because I really liked it. And this is just my opinion. I don't know if it's going to stick with me like years later where I'm like, I got to revisit this. I got to watch scenes of it on YouTube. I don't know if it's a movie like that for me, but that's just my closing thoughts. I really enjoyed it. I think if you're a really hardcore film aficionado, cinephile, letterbox user, like, you know, you should definitely watch it, and you're probably already going to watch it. But as far as like it really catching on, I don't know. I don't think so.
Yeah, that's always the trick when it comes to this time of the year, right? Like I said, it's breaking down like who these movies are really for, and I feel like that discussion and that argument is more important now than it has ever been. Because again, in an era where media just in general is constantly kind of being relegated to content, right? Kind of the whole the whole value of it is just inherently decreasing. You know, they're constantly striving more and more. It's like they're not movies and you know, and TV and media in general, that was not made for everyone. It's made to like find a certain audience, right? And so that's that's always got to be talked about when it comes to especially movies like this, which are aiming for the Oscars, which historically have been made to represent the best in film. We're all educated. We all know that's not the case, but as far as my final thoughts go on it, as far as Oscars go, as far as wins, I only have this winning adapted screenplay and actor. Just because the best actor race is so weird right now, and in a year where Will Smith is going for
who are the other guys?
The front runners.
Who's nominated?
No, the nominations won't happen until February. But as far as the front runners, if I'm remembering, the big three right now: Cumberbatch, Will Smith for King Richard, and Denzel for Tragedy of Macbeth. Those are the big three.
My guess is that Will Smith is taking it.
You think it's going to be Will Smith?
Well, because you got to look at it from the Oscar campaign,
right?
He's getting that push.
this time thing. Because the whole thing for me is I'm just worried that Will Smith is marketing it too soon because he's already on the marketing trail and it's only December. Like, you usually don't want to start those until like January, February, especially since the Oscars are so much later again this year.
Early bird gets the worm.
Yeah, but the same thing happened with Michael Keaton back in 2014. Michael Keaton was campaigning hard, but he went way too early, and Eddie Redmayne with Theory of Everything managed to pick up a little bit of steam, and it came out and stole it from him. And on top of it, 2014, you want to talk about a year of Oscar bait films over like better films that deserve
2014, I mean, that's the
Nightcrawler snub. That's that's the Boyhood losing out Best Picture. That's the Whiplash Miles Teller snub. Selma, David Oyelowo was not nominated. Gone Girl's completely shut out.
But here's the thing. Kind of, I don't want to dismiss the whole Oscar discussion, but those movies that you just mentioned are the ones from 2014 that are remembered and that people love.
True. Exactly.
I know the Oscars.
So then real quick, let me ask you then, do you buy into the 5-year argument then? The thing that Oscars shouldn't happen for 5 years because we need time to gestate and see whether these movies are actually a thing. You don't think? Adam. What about you?
No, it's typical. At the end of the year, you go over the year. You don't say, okay, at the end of this year, let's wait 5 years.
But that's always been the inherent kind of like existential argument, I guess, surrounding the Oscars is the fact that they're supposed to honor the best in film. But the problem is how you can't really accurately measure the best of film without that amount of given time. And so inherently, that's going to create a problem where versus the films that are honored versus the films that are remembered throughout time. You know.
I don't think it's the Oscars' job or mission objective to signal like these are the films that you all, the American and global public, should remember. That's our job, and that's the job that we'll do on our own. The Oscars is just there. It's just you're being honored and recognized by your peers. It just happens to be on TV, so it's a TV show. But I don't think it's like the Oscars need to nominate these films because we need to get it right. I mean, because they got it right with Parasite. Oh, but they didn't get it right with Spotlight. But
I guess then, because you're right, I do 100% buy into that argument. But I guess then the bigger problem and the bigger question comes from how they need to expand their scope as far as the movies that go. Because we all know they've been making all this statement about change. And like certainly a lot of the films that have been nominated have been very, very interesting. But I definitely do think they need to make more of an effort as far as being more inclusive when it comes to just genre in general. Because there's still, to me, enough films being made that aren't the big tent poles, right? Because I know their stance against the big tent poles. I don't necessarily agree with it because I do still enjoy my fair share of it, but I understand why they don't go for it. But as far as greater encompassing it when it comes to scope of genre, because the fact that Get Out really was only nominated because it became a political message movie, not because of how much of an impact it had. Like Get Out to me was really the last instance of like a film having like a major impact on the culture, and not because, and so much so that it became like the Oscar bait, like the surprises. That's what I guess if I could like get at my gripes as far as what I want the Oscars to do, as far as like, my continuing kind of gripes that I've been having with them over these last couple of years. That's kind of what I'm looking for.
Well, because you always want them to honor that movie that breaches that balance,
right?
That
exactly.
Between like,
because that's becoming even more rare nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, like that's the goal. Like, you look at a film like a Whiplash. That was probably the movie from 2014 that like everybody, not that a lot of the mainstream people saw,
right? But that a majority of people would have agreed and said that's the best movie of the year. I still really love Birdman, but I get where they're coming from, And so as far as kind of this movie's potential, I guess I understand. I don't like it, but I understand why they're going for more of like kind of the feel good schmaltzy movies, because those are the movies that like again people are gonna watch. They're gonna feel good and nice afterwards. They're gonna have a good time. They're gonna look at their family members who they just watch it with and be like, oh man, this just makes me feel so happy and enjoying of the things that I have,
The Oscars have always done that though. They've always
but they've always been like the rare ones that have broken through. And I'm not saying that movies have to be like all negative and all miserable in order to like, be recognized, but it definitely for me, it's like, man, it always seems that like the ones that have more of a well-placed emphasis on their craft always seem to be about so much more negative and darker subject matter. But what can I say? Movies are always reflective of the times that we live in, and I feel like that's kind of a great spot to end off on. My final reviewing and my final kind of critique and ranking of this and rating, that's the word I was looking for, of this movie. I gave this movie 4.5 out of 5 stars. This is easily one of my favorite movies of the year. This is one of the most tense films that I've seen of the year. It's another film, again, that accomplishes absolutely everything with seemingly nothing. And the fact that, I don't know, it's a pretty cool Western, and we don't get a whole lot of those nowadays. Adam, what's your final thoughts and star ratings?
I'm gonna give Power to the Dog 9.5 out of 10, or also is that a
4.5 out of 5. Yeah.
So yeah, I'm gonna give it a 9.5 out of 10. Yeah, I think that for any film students going into it, they should definitely study this and watch it. I think it was really well done. Yeah, this was so much fun. It was every time. I mean, I've only been on, what is it, 3 times now?
3 times now, yeah. And only twice in the video format.
Yeah, and it's great every time. So let's keep these up. Brandon, thanks for joining. I would have liked to hear a little bit more of what you had to think, but you were patiently waiting and listening, and because there was a lot to go over with this one movie, but Dom, thank you. Brandon, thanks again.
Of course. And Adam, real quick, plug your socials. Where can the good people find you?
You can find me on. I spoke out of. I messed up last time. You can find me at Adam_Somer_films on Instagram, which I'm gonna start posting on there more. I've never been a big social person, but I'm gonna try and start posting more and being consistent with that. And then you can also find me on Twitter at MRARS97. I probably use that a good amount more than other social media, so that's where you can find me.
All right. And Brandon, where can the good people find you?
I'll just promote my letterbox. So I'll just say
letterbox.
Yeah,
Make it big.
I'll just say Brandon Fallett, like one word, all lowercase. Just that.
Yeah, and you guys have been on long enough now that it's long past time that you guys have nicknames. I still gotta brainstorm it out. I still gotta think long and hard. But believe it or not, it took me like 3 months or like 3 to 6 months to come up with Chris's nickname, the TV nerd, which he's had now for the longest time. And it was like right there in front of me like the whole time, and I should have been able to figure it out. But I'll come up with something for you guys because it's long past time. Like I said, I'm so glad that you guys are back here where you guys belong at the Talking TV family, and you guys are gonna be seeing a lot more of Brandon and Adam as time goes on. Like I said, we got 3 podcasts left for the year. I could not have asked for better co-hosts to kind of jumpstart our little Talking TV Oscar race that we have going on here. You can, of course, follow me on Facebook and Instagram at Movie Nerd Reviews, but be sure to follow the podcast socials at Talking TV Podcast on both Facebook and Instagram. Be sure to click the subscribe button also below. Click the bell next with that way you guys get notified every time we put up new content. We put up content. We still got so much content for you guys coming down the pipeline. Like I said, 3 more podcast episodes, 2 more Succession recap episodes. I've got a couple of top 10 lists still coming out. Adam, I know that you as well, you and I are planning to do a little something for Don't Look Up when that comes out. Be sure to also stay tuned for mine and Dustin's up and coming Paul Thomas Anderson retrospective, where we're going to cover all of his films about one of our favorite filmmakers in general. And as always, people, from myself, from Brandon, from Adam, 12 seasons in a short film, and watch more fucking movies. We'll see you guys next time.